Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining this session. We're talking about decarbonisation. So this is complex, isn't it? We've talked about this for many years for this industry. This industry, fashion, has to really halve emissions by 2030. That should be the goal, and that will contribute to UK efforts. The larger companies, the larger clothing companies in the UK, most of them do have science-based targets of that nature. We're going to hear from Katharine at Marks & Spencer's, who I think the carbon target is 55% cuts by 2030. Chris from Burberry, where I think it's 46.2% on the Scope 3 emissions. That's the goal for 2030. Philippa from Nobody's Child, from an SME perspective. Wendy from Santander, to give us a bit of insight from an investor finance kind of lens. And of course, Shailja, you know. So halving emissions, large companies playing their part. Large companies have most of the share of the carbon footprint of this industry in this country. And the other thing to say is that the biggest impact area is the supply chain. So in your breakout sessions, I think on this discussion as well, materials and manufacturing are two very big hotspots. And we're always thinking, where do you put your effort for the greatest result, the greatest impact? So consider that in your sessions as well as the discussion here. And then we also have SMEs. You know, there's something like 60,000 SMEs, great creatives like yourselves, and they have a part to play as well. But I think we'll start with Shailja. So Shailja, we're trying to look at how industry steps up. We're trying to look at how government steps in to support. IPF is obviously playing its part. A bit of vision from you. How do you see the future, a low-carbon future?
A low-carbon future, thank you. I guess what the British Fashion Council's intending to do, and this is really the, I guess, day one of that, is set that intention for a coherent UK position when it comes to net zero. There are so many amazing initiatives and advancements happening when it comes to climate targets, but actually how do we bring that together as a single voice and a single direction of travel that includes the SME sector as well as the larger brands that are represented here today? I think that's something that the BFC can really do to help inform policy change as well. We're uniquely positioned to do that. So if we can help bring that alignment, feed that into government and ensure everyone's pointing in the same direction, we're just hoping that's going to lead to efficiency of action and meet UN goals. And on the back of that, we would like to also chart a path to see how fashion can be recognised in UK's formal climate goals and targets through the nationally determined contributions. So it may be a bit of a snakes and ladders map to get there, but I think with everyone on this panel and everyone in this room, that's the vision and what we're intending to take forward.
Okay, thank you, Shailja. So it's sort of industry stepping up, but there's a policy interplay at some point that we need to work on here and consider that as well. Katharine, if we start with industry and manufacturing and materials, but you might want to talk about other hotspots. Where is Marks & Spencer's now? How do you go further forward? And also a bit of advice for your peers, I mean, the industry moving further forward.
Yeah. We were just talking, obviously, M&S started in 2007 with its Plan A, and that's our sustainability strategy that underpins kind of our business values and how we move forward. And we reset that in 2021. And that was really to focus on net zero and focus across sort of three areas. And one was on responsibly sourced materials, so really thinking about the fibres and the materials that we choose in the first place, because 25% of the carbon sat in that part. So it's really important to think about the supply chain and the type of fibres that we're selecting and the targets that we set and work with the buying and design teams on. So the recycled polyester, the Better Cotton Initiative, who we work very closely with, thinking about recycled fibres and the targets that we work for there and moving forward to 2030 targets. And then in terms of the manufacturing part, we know from the work that we've done we've worked very closely with South Pole, a carbon consultancy, that 38% of the carbon is sat in the dyeing and finishing. So that's a massive part for us. So we've been working very closely with our tier 2, so the wet processors, so those that are dyeing and finishing our products. And we've worked very closely with Cascale. I'm sure many of you know of them, and the Higg Index, so that's the facility environmental module. So it's an audit that looks at the all of the environmental information from the facilities, the factories. And what we're able to do with that is then find the hotspots and then work with the facilities to look at decarbonisation plans. And we're there able to input and work on those plans. And then lastly is the waste and circularity. So really important to look at the waste within the supply chain. So working with reverse resources on looking at how we can use that waste that's sat within our factories, but also waste in the UK. So we've been part of the ACT project with UKFT and many other brands and collaborations, and looking at the waste that's in the UK in terms of the textiles recycling. And also having our take-back scheme with our friends at Oxfam for over 16 years now. And then obviously new partnerships like Repair with Sojo, which obviously has been a new partnership with us since August, which is obviously working with experts like Sojo has been a really, really exciting collaboration. So lots started, but still lots to do and lots of further opportunity. And I think it's really about collaboration, being part of SIFIN, being part of ACT, being part of UKFT, Textiles 2030. It really is about working with other retailers and brands to see where we can collaborate and help move things forward.
Thank you. And Chris, same question.
Yeah, so I mean, firstly, I'll just start by giving a bit of context as to the importance of climate action at Burberry. So we recognise that reducing our emissions, managing the risks associated with climate change is absolutely essential to Burberry's long-term success as a business and a brand. And that's why we've committed to achieving net zero in line with the Science Based Targets Initiative requirements. And as Dax mentioned, also we've got near-term targets to guide us on that journey as well. But as Katharine's already alluded to, and especially for us as a luxury brand, the emissions associated with the production of raw materials is a particular challenge. It's an area where we're taking action. We are committed to addressing raw material emissions through our material selection. So 55% of our key raw materials last year were certified or responsibly sourced. We're also working with our suppliers and startups on next generation materials. But I think the reality is for ourselves, our peers, the wider industry, traceability remains an enormous opportunity. Traceability is essential for identifying opportunities right across the supply chain to reduce carbon emissions, but especially at that raw material production stage. And once you've identified those opportunities, to Katharine's point, it's about what collaboration do you need with suppliers, with peers, to bring about the changes required across the industry. That's why we're part of industry-wide initiatives such as the likes of the Fashion Pact. And I think, just as an aside, I mean, listening to some of the smaller brands today talk about, for example, the role of the BFC's low carbon transition program, what's great to see is that companies of all sizes recognise the need for collective action in order to be able to address hotspots, whether that be materials, manufacturing, or other areas as well.
Thank you, Chris. Very comprehensive. And Philippa, you're juggling because you're running a business, you're incredibly creative, you're now trying to think about these things as well. How do SMEs and you do what you do more? How do you go forward?
Well, we were really, really fortunate to be part of the Low Carbon Transition Programme last year. Met some absolutely amazing peers, but also solutions providers. I'll give a little shout out to Seedling, which is the guys who we were measuring our carbon footprint with, and that lets you look under the bonnet of the sort of carbon accounting methodology. And I thought that that was really key for sort of not just, you know, furthering understanding for my team about the sort of input and output of all the options for that we had basically at our fingertips, but also galvanizing other departments, because it cannot just be sustainability doing this. It takes a village. You need to have the merchandisers having KPIs about sort of like how the products are getting to the distribution centre. So we've made sort of like a policy. I'll never be prom queen, but we've made a policy where we avoid all air freight unless it's got CEO sign-off. We've done a materials matrix, which will change or update year on year, and I've set some quite ambitious targets for all of the product areas. And it does need to be different for every product area, because for denim, for example, it's like shooting fish in a barrel. It's organic cotton, it's recycled cotton. It's trying to avoid, you know, elastane where you possibly can. But then with, for example, knitwear, sometimes that can be a bit more complicated with the fibre blends and things. So we can't have a cookie-cutter approach to the matrix for every product group. And then also bringing the suppliers on the journey has been really fun, and sort of like, I know I'm asking them a lot at the moment for digital product passport and giving me all of their environmental information, but I've promised them that I'm going to make them their own little report so that they can sort of use it they have something out of it, basically, out of all the hard work they're putting in for us, so that it's sort of got a bit more of an echo of the just transition rather than me just bossing people around from a laptop in Camden. But being part of the low carbon transition programme was amazing, and I think I'm really reassured that it's going to be moving around the UK, I think, not just London.
That's the ambition. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Philippa, that you're spinning plates. And Wendy, you've heard the supply chain is so important. And we're talking about how do you you maximise your effort with maximise impact results. What's the investor view, the finance view on supporting that low carbon supply chain?
So the reason why it's important to banks is because for the banks to be able to get to net zero, we need every single one of our clients to get to net zero. So every single one of our clients will be thinking about the journey that they're on, and therefore it then filters down through their supply chains as well. So just listening to what Philippa said about making this a partnership, if you give me this information, I will give you something in return, is so very, very important. We have the large corporates that are required to do the transition plans, to think about their journey, all of their regulations, but as it starts to filter down to the supply chain and the SMEs, they're going, where do we go with this? And education and awareness, both within the supply chain but also within the consumer base, is so very, very important. I'm in a very privileged position, in fact, that I just love my job, but I spend some of my time looking at the data that we have to collect within Santander. And my argument is that we have to make sure that the data that we're providing for the regulators has to be able to come back to me to be able to support our relationship directors to help support our clients on that journey. So that example of providing a report at the end of this is just gold dust. And that's what I would love to see that all large corporates do as they think about their transition plans, thinking, right, we need to get to net zero, so how do I need to help my suppliers get to net zero? Because if you think about it, we're only ever as good as our weakest link. So where's that weakest link in my supply chain, and what's important to them to do that? And, you know, I learned something new today. I believe every day is a school day. DPP, that's so powerful. The education challenge that we have with this, for the consumer, for the supplier, is so key. But if we're going to end up with a QR code that's going to give us so much information, I think that helps us all go on that journey to suddenly wake up and go, wow, I didn't know that about the product I'm wearing, and this is really important to me. And then people become invested in the challenge, and that hopefully will create the tipping point that we need to get to.
Okay, thank you. And just to drill into this a little bit further, Katharine, you know, Marks & Spencer's at high levels on the core materials, certified materials, so that brings down, that works towards the carbon target. You're also trying to look at who your most strategic suppliers at any one time. You're trying to presumably engage them on how do they set targets, how do they carry out carbon footprint assessments, how do they then meet those targets themselves. Can you say a little bit more about that approach and how that might advise wider industry?
Yeah, so what we've done is we've worked with the Apparel Impact Institute, and we chose to work with them because lots of other big brands are working with them. So actually our impact could be much wider, because when we started to look at our biggest fabric mills, obviously they don't just supply us, they supply 30, 40, 50 other brands. We might be 2%, 3% of them, but they, you know, the other 90-odd% were supplying many other brands. So if we're able to make an impact there, the impact spreads wider. So we looked at our top 100, and actually by working with our top 50, the other 50 were already on the same schemes with the other brands, so the impact was then much wider. So what happens is we paid for an assessment using the HIG data. So again, there's not 50 million other audits, there's one audit that's used for every brand. So it stops that audit fatigue. And then with the assessment that's done by an engineer, we then paid for an extra assessment that they go in, they look around the facility, and they look for loads of energy improvement that we can do in that facility, which A, saves money because they can pay for less energy, but B, it reduces the carbon. And then they start to look for ways to start to move to renewable energy, which obviously we all know it makes a significant impact. And why the carbon's so high in that part of the supply chain is because they're heating lots of water, so the thermal energy is so significant and the carbon's so high. So if we can make an impact there, we're making a really big difference. So by working at that part of the supply chain, we knew we could really make, you know, a dent in the carbon and start to obviously make an impact for ourselves, but obviously work with loads of other brands at that point. So that's obviously hopefully making a dent in the carbon as we start to hit towards 2030. And also 2030 is not very far away. So by working now, as the engineering works happens over the next 2 to 3 years, it means we can start to hopefully make the inroads to that target.
Okay, so you're going deep into the supply chain. And Chris, what's the best kinds of incentives? I mean, do you have to somehow find financial support for those suppliers, or is it other kinds of incentives?
Yeah, I think I'd build on some of what Katharine just said there in terms of have to make the barriers to entry to climate action for suppliers as seamless as possible. And that means consistent data collection, that means obviously consistent incentives. It means, I suppose, working with your peers, but also involving suppliers in those conversations to ensure that the solutions that you're suggesting are A, fit for purpose, and B, that there's a route to financing as well. Because one of the, I suppose, the things that we often hear is that we can advise and we can bring in external parties to advise on what the solutions could be, but if there's a capital barrier there, then how do we look to overcome that? So I think that's a real sort of challenge across all aspects of the fashion industry, is helping suppliers firstly identify where there are opportunities, but secondly then actually realise those opportunities through suitable financing solutions.
Right, okay. So we talked a little bit about industry. We've learned quite a bit about the different approaches. There's quite a lot of commonalities there. If we go into the policy area now, Wendy, you know, fashion's not part of the NDC as Shailja and I and others have been talking about yet. It may well be in the future. How could government step in? I mean, I think some part of the brainstorm here is, in the sessions to follow, is what kinds of policies could be considered. Have you got any sort of thoughts on that?
So the interesting thing is, this new government, I suppose it's nearly a year old, I've never known so much interaction with the government and their willingness to listen. There's a hell of a lot of research papers that have been written, whether it's about renewable energy, it's about mortgages, etc. But they do seem to be listening, and I seem to be on more conference calls asking for our opinion. So I think there is an open door that we're pushing at, and I think policy helps. The problem is, where does the incentives come from, and how do we get those incentives? But I think the interesting thing is that what we have to make sure is that, as with sustainability, and we get it embedded in everything across that we do, that we look at other sectors, what has been done, and seeing where we can replicate. And just thinking about the digital passport, if you think about the agricultural sector, they had to create a digital passport for animals after foot and mouth and the health scares. So it's been done before. So what can we learn, and how can we incentivize and utilize those areas that have been done? What you do find, though, is that regulation seems to be the one that, as it trickles down, it really has a big impact. But one of the things that we have to be certain is we cannot keep going put some regulation in, rein it back, put it in, rein it back. We have to have certainty and guarantee that it's going to be there for 5, 10, 15 years so that people can invest, because we've seen what happens when you've incentivized, and we can look at what happened with regards to renewable energy. Back in 2013, all the incentives disappeared. Lots of SMEs suddenly went bust because they geared up to support that, and it was all gone. So there's so much nervousness now as to, well, if we gear up, are we going to be supported? So regulatory, I think, has to be fair and simple, but has to be there to make sure it's for the long run.
Yeah, I think it has to be fair and simple, because the CSDD and the CSRD have been overcomplicated, as we've been hearing about. I hear the same thing, government's in listening mode, which means perhaps the industry has to step up and really be proactive in thinking what kinds of policies would be good things to think about. Philippa, any sort of thoughts on either general support for SMEs or policy support areas?
Well, I think that it'd be really nice for the UK to start also sort of backing DPPs as well, because I do see them as a Trojan horse for the whole spectrum of the sort of value chain industry, however you want to call it. You can obviously trace your raw materials, which is upstream. You can sort of look at the supplier energy performance, which can help you sort of with things like decarbonisation. Also, the traceability can help you aligned to the CSRD and the CSDDD. And then at the end, we were talking before we went onto this panel that it can also be used at the end of useful life to sort of like gather things, you know, once they've been used, and so that they can be re-entered into the system. And so I think if we were to really back one piece of policy, rather than trying to sort of continually reinvent the wheel, we should just drive down the road of DPP, and that will help brands sort of, you know, align to all of these nascent and emerging and sometimes quite daunting policies, especially for SMEs. People are petrified, aren't they? And they sort of don't know where to start. But a journey of 1,000 miles starts with a single step, and it could literally be just you ringing up your supplier, and instead of having a conversation about production or packaging or freight, it could literally just be about sustainability and see what they're up to. And they might well have solar panels on their roofs that they aren't telling you about, or they might be harvesting rainwater, or they might even have their own sustainability strategy that they haven't been asked, so they're not going to give it. So, yeah. That was a rambling way of answering your question. I think DPP would be a good one to focus on.
That's good. No, very crisp. Thank you. Chris?
Yeah, so I mean, we've spoken about the UK's NDC. I think the first thing to note is that I think the fashion industry has such an important role to play in supporting the UK and achieving its net zero ambitions, not just because of the scale of the impact that the industry collectively has, that we've spoken about today, but also that cultural resonance that we have as an industry, and to Farhana's point earlier around driving behaviour change. And I suppose this is a consistent theme, so anybody wanting, I suppose, disagreement on the panel is probably not going to find it, but that need for consistent, clear regulatory roadmaps, ideally for us as a larger brand that is aligned with other regulatory regimes, particularly the EU, is really, really important. I think for larger brands operating globally, fashion industry is inherently global. So if we're trying to bring about positive environmental change within our supply chain, we need to have a coherent, holistic approach to that. So therefore, regulatory alignment really does support that as an achieving that.
Thank you. Katharine?
I think from the other one that we haven't mentioned is probably the end producer responsibility for textiles. Obviously, we've all been through packaging, and that's been fun. So I think in reality, it's a EPR for textiles that works for business and for the environment. So it's one that does the right thing for business, but also does the right thing for getting funds that will drive a future textile recycling for the UK, and that the funds will go into that. So, you know, there's been a lot of work already being driven by the UKFT and WEFT and a set of brands, and if that can continue, I think, and inform government, I think that would be really, really important. And that could, you know, we all know there's a waste problem in textiles, and that could really make some significant change in the UK, and also give us those circular fibres that we all need in our product in the future, and exports from the UK. So I think that could be quite an exciting future for us. So,
good ideas. I think as Shailja pointed out to me, the Textiles Exchange previously has raised the idea of low-carbon tariffs so that all the good work in the UK is not undermined by any kind of high-carbon imports. However, tariffs is something maybe to stay away from or go towards, I don't know. So moving into customer engagement, I noticed, I think Allbirds Moonshot is now finally out. It's the first carbon neutral shoe, we're told. It's linked with regenerative wool farming and reforestation, so you have to dig into the details. But it's been, a lot of hype, a lot of good marketing. I mean, Shailja, shall I ask you about anything you've seen where you've sort of seen some good marketing of this low carbon push?
I think anything that is able to demonstrate to the customer base the efforts that the brand is doing, because I think there's so much fear to even make a start on that because of the regulatory landscape, the CMA, the UK Green Claims Directive. So it's almost like a fear to share. And again, I think Farhana was also talking about that earlier, about the fear of sharing that you're using recycled fibres. So there's a lot of power in taking that step forward and taking your customers on the journey with you, because it's really discombobulating all the different terminology out there. What is net zero? What is net positive? But I think at the same time, probably since COP26, certainly my experience in the UK, there's just so much more awareness and desire to know more in the public consciousness when it comes to living that 1.5 degree lifestyle, understanding more on that, and how, as individuals, we all have a role to play. So I think that answered your question.
No, you have. Philippa, can you talk to your customers about this? How do you do it?
Yes, in short. So I spent 5 years as a consultant, and so this is my first in-house role. It's my year and day anniversary today. But I used to have 4 tips for green claims, and it was substantiate everything. Don't cherry pick, so don't go, oh wow, we're using recycled packaging, but inside is a PVC product. Acknowledge the journey. Sustainability is not a light switch moment where you're suddenly just going to flick a switch and be bam, you're sustainable. It is a total journey, and you've got to just be mindful that there's always going to be something that you're doing wrong. And then the other one is talk about the things that you're doing wrong. I was on a panel with Cecilia from the CMA a few years ago, and she said that she'd find it much harder to conclude if a company was greenwashing if they were as honest about their learnings as they were about their wins. And I think there's storytelling, which is lovely, brandy, fun, sexy, but then there's substantiation. And you need to have that bedrock of substantiation for the nerds like me who'll go straight to the bottom of the website and find the sustainability reports and the modern slavery statements and all the compliance stuff. And then if you've got that in order, you can talk about lovely, branded, cool sustainability storytelling.
And Chris, I mean, as Philippa says, you have to substantiate, but just having a big push so that it's in the minds of customers, how do you even do that?
Yeah, I mean, just to start with, I mean, our Burberry Forward strategy, customers are the heart of absolutely everything that we do. So it's important that we meet changing expectations from customers. I was reading some research from a consultancy this week which said 65% of fashion customers really care about the environment, but rarely does that feature in the top purchasing factors when making a purchasing decision. Far more resonance to customers are things such as product quality, product durability. At Burberry, our products are crafted with the highest quality materials. They're made to last. Quality, durability are essential components of this industry's transition to net zero. And I think customers can understand and feel quality, durability, more than they can sustainability often. I think sustainability can be quite a nebulous concept, but quality and durability really do resonate, and they are essential for that net zero journey. So for us, it's about engaging them in a language which does resonate. We have repair and refresh services that we advertise in store. We're expanding our offerings of rental and resale, circular business models. So for me, it's about, those initiatives help us keep products, materials in circulation for longer, but they also engage customers in a way that perhaps resonates a little bit more closer to home.
And Katharine?
Yeah, I think everyone's covered it really well. I think we have to be careful we're not green hushing, and that we are talking about our products in the right way, and that we are substantiating, as everyone said. We've done some work on sort of Plan A stories, like short little content on different social media channels, where we've tried to talk about where we get our cashmere from, where our cotton comes from, to try and talk to people about, literally tier 4 right the way through to finished garment, just to try and get people to think about how products are made well, made to last, and how to love them for longer, just to try and get people to think a bit differently about their products. But I think everybody's, nervous about what to say and how to say. But I think it's important, as you say, to talk about the quality and the value of a product, and that makes people really think about how to look after their products and, pass them on and give them another life.
Right, okay, we're going to wrap up. You've had some fantastic insights to inform your thinking, to add to your thinking in the breakout sessions. I would encourage you to be very bold. So the first point is focus on the big hotspots, the big impact areas. Think about the big wins and how you deliver carbon savings. Policy, we've heard some great ideas. Be bold, be proactive. What policies could we recommend to government that would be serving this agenda? And then customer engagement. Avoid the green hushing, avoid the green washing, somehow have a balance of being bold but not too bold and over-claiming. So also think about what are good examples where brands have got this right. But thank you to our fantastic panel, and thank you.